Hey everybody, Shane here from Vulgar Display Gaming, and today I'm joined by the legendary Howard Johnson, a man that's 360 degrees in the music industry. How you doing, Howard? Thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Shane. Nice to come on your show.
I really appreciate that. I just want to start off by saying, if people don't know who you are, give us a quick rundown of your, entire career, however you want to go about it.
Okay, I'll keep it short. My career in the music industry started when I was a very young guy, probably 14 years old, when I was growing up in Manchester in the north of England, and was a passionate rock fan. And decided to display my love of rock by starting a fanzine. Typical thing to do for a lot of people in the UK in the late 70s when I was growing up was to start a fanzine because it was cheap and easy and you could go and sell it at gigs, and the written word was the way that people found out about music back in those days. There was very little that you could hear on the UK radio stations. I know a lot of Americans are quite surprised by this, but even though the new wave of British heavy metal was so influential, it was very much a minority sport and a cult music in the UK. It wasn't mainstream at all. There was only one station in the whole of the country that played anything like of rock music, and that was one show for 2 hours on a Friday night.
Really?
So that was it.
Oh, wow.
You got. And so the written word was a powerful medium in those days, and so I started a fanzine based around the bands that I loved, and used to really run it pretty much alone, writing, printing, selling, standing outside venues, trying to get people with long hair and denim jackets to buy a copy of the magazine. And then through that, somebody at the most influential music newspaper in the UK at that time, which was called Sounds, got to hear about what I was doing. And Sounds was one of 3 national music papers that were vying for supremacy, and the other 2 was excuse me, The Enemy and a paper called The Melody Maker. And those 3 titles were quite differentiated in terms of what they covered, and The Enemy and The Melody Maker was a little bit snooty about hard rock, wasn't really interested, but Sounds saw that there was a kind of an underbelly of support for that music that wasn't being catered for, and so started to cover rock bands much more extensively and with a kind of an open mind and with people who genuinely like that music. So that attracted me to Sounds, and I basically sent copies of my fanzine to Sounds and was pestering them and picking up the phone and trying to get hold of the editor and talk to them, and eventually they kind of caved in and crumbled and gave me a chance to write an article that I was suggesting, which was kind of a roundup of the best of European metal that was out at the time. And so I got that published in 1980 when I was 15 years old.
Oh.
And I was very lucky that just around about that time, not probably 6 months later, the same publishing company that was publishing Sounds had realised that there were a lot of people out there who were excited about the coverage of rock music that was in Sounds, and so they launched a spin-off title, which you may have heard of, which was called Kerrang. Mm-hmm. And because I made my love of that kind of music known, I was fortunate enough to get an opportunity to start working for Kerrang. So I started working for Kerrang at the start of 1981 when I was 16, I think. Yeah, 16 years old. And within 3 weeks of having started freelancing for Kerrang, I got my first big commission, which was 4 days on the road with Sammy Hagar. So it was quite a quite an introduction.
At 16, holy shit. No, that's insane. And that was just the start. We're gonna go way, go more into it. So I want to say, how do you perceive the evolution of metal and rock over your entire career? Are there any particular trends that you've seen in this industry?
Yeah, I think that it's been noticeable that probably the biggest change in how hard rock music is perceived from when I started to where we are now is that there are now so many subgenres and different styles and different traits of rock that people attach themselves to and like and feel affinity with. Whereas when I was growing up in the UK, and I imagine probably the same in the States, rock music was a broad church. It wasn't unusual when I was growing up for somebody to be at a gig with a denim jacket on, which would have patches of Rush, Judas Priest, REO Speedwagon, Journey, Iron Maiden, Sammy Hagar. You know, a real broad variety of rock bands that all came under the same banner of kind of like hard rock, and that wasn't seen as weird.
Yeah.
And yet, I think in some ways the genre has been diluted a lot because everyone has got a kind of little niche now that they want to be identified with, and I think that that's probably to the detriment of the scene entirely. It didn't seem weird for people to go, you know, I've got a certain time when I'm in the mood for Journey, a certain time when I'm in the mood for Maiden, a certain time when I'm in the mood for AC/DC. Didn't seem weird. And I think now that's probably been lost a little bit. I'm probably not the best person to comment on that because, you know, I was heavily involved in Kerrang for 10 years as a freelancer between kind of 81 and 91. And from that point, I then went off to edit Metal Hammer magazine, and that was obviously keeping me involved in that arena. But when I left Metal Hammer magazine in 92 to go and work on the kind of business side, management side with Iron Maiden, that was really the last I worked in music for a very long time. And I only came back to music journalism, gosh, many years later in 2016, when I started working on Rock Candy magazine as the editor. So there was a big gap in my CV, if you want to call it that. So in terms of where rock and metal is now, probably hard for me to say, because also Rock Candy is an unashamedly retro magazine. So, you know, my field of expertise and my knowledge is having worked with a lot of those bands in their heyday and then cycling back to them now and being able to talk to them in a way that I couldn't at the time when I was 19 and they were, you know, multi-million selling rock stars. Is a different dynamic. Of course, now I'm a much older guy, and a lot of those guys who are still playing in those bands have got, you know, less, probably less ego involved, less desire to sell themselves than they had back in the day. And so I think there is a way that we talk to each other now as older guys that is perhaps more revealing, because they have less to lose. They've lost some of that kind of young macho bravado. I'm a better, more experienced journalist, so I hope that what we do in Rock Candy now is much more relevant to the truth, I suppose, and getting to understand the real personalities of the people who made the music and what motivated them. So that's great, but it's, you know, it would be a lie for me to say that I've really got my finger on the pulse of what's going on in new music in rock and metal these days. That's probably a question better asked of other people.
Well, I can say for me, I'm younger, so I'm only 31, and I grew up with, my dad got me into heavy metal, like Iron Maiden, and then my mom was into hair metal. They were both into heavy metal and hair metal, so I have, like, an Exodus shirt on, Iron Maiden hat, I got a bunch of, like, I got, like, Steeler over there in my vinyl collection, I have, like, a bunch of hair metal, punk, everything. I think it might be for me to say when I go to shows now, I am seeing a lot more punk patches at the metal shows. I'm seeing a lot more crossover, which is good. But I think it was a big detriment to the whole scene. And I feel like that's what's maybe caused a bit of stagnation in rock and metal. When we start,
I think that's entirely possible. And you know, for all the excitement of the movements that I lived through, which was kind of, you know, the most important ones would be that hair metal scene that sprung out of the Sunset Strip in the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, and then the thrash scene that happened, you know, 83 with Metallica. Those were probably the two most important evolutions of my time when I was really heavily involved in rock music. And clearly the period when I moved out of journalism, moved into the business side, coincided with the arrival of the grunge explosion. And obviously that was an incredibly important part of what was going on in rock, and and evolved and changed a lot of things in terms of how people perceived rock music, not only in terms of the style of the music that was being made, but also in terms of the attitude of the people who were making it. Certain attitudes that were kind of considered perfectly acceptable, pretty degrading to women, pretty not very what you might call modern in terms of attitudes to a lot of things. That kind of got blown out of the water, and that was overnight turned into something that was deemed unacceptable by a lot of people. And I guess the problem with that was it threw the baby out with the bathwater, so everybody was tied with the same brush, and everybody was from that era was a bit of a pariah for a period of time. And of course things come full circle, and there's a big resurgence of those bands now, lots of those packages and cruises that go out there, and clearly there's an appetite for that music now that in the early part of the 90s was just completely washed away. So that era was very exciting when I was involved, and I was a young man, so I was 19, 20, 21 years old, and so I lived that to the full. But you look back on it now, and even on some of the kind of the pieces that I wrote in Kerrang, there's certain things that you write and you cringe a little bit and you say, I wish I hadn't done that. Or certain headlines that were attached to articles that I wrote that maybe I didn't have anything to do with, but you look back on now and you go, that's not the most sensitive way of approaching the subject matter. But you also have to remember that you can't put yourself back into those times and make the same judgments we do today. It's
different time period. Yeah,
mentalities were different. I think we have to be careful about being too judgmental about all that, but at the same time I'm not interested really in purely looking at that era through a rose-tinted lens. I think you can talk about those issues and talk about the sexism that existed and the glorifying of certain lifestyle choices that maybe didn't suit a lot of people. The amount of times I hear stories from people who were in bands at the time who basically people who lost it all by getting fucked up on drugs, which at the time that was not a narrative that anybody wanted to talk about, because it was all about the party. So there's a lot of stuff that was really fun about that time, and I think one of the sad things about grunge was that it became very unfashionable to have some fun with music, and music is supposed to be fun. But I think within that context there are also things that have evolved, and for the better. So you wouldn't want to go back there 100%, but there are many things about it that were really fun, and some great music was made, and we all enjoyed ourselves, and that's not really to be kind of forgotten.
Yeah, that scene in itself, grunge, it was almost like it was against itself. Like, wait, we're getting too cool. We shouldn't be this cool.
Grunge was a funny movement, wasn't it? Because I don't think there's any doubt that music needed a kind of a spring clean. Everything had got very formulaic and sameish, and what was constituting rock felt a lot of the time to be very manufactured. So it did need somebody to come along and kind of, like I say, do some cleaning. But, a lot of what went with that was very nihilistic. It didn't seem to help a lot of those people in terms of their private lives and their mental health and all those kind of things. There was a lot more dark stuff that was going on in grunge than ever had gone on the Sunset Strip. And that's also down to the drugs of choice that people had. Heroin wasn't fashionable on the Sunset Strip. I'm not saying nobody took it, because clearly Guns N' Roses were very vocal about their use of heroin. But it didn't seem to be so pervasive. Certainly not in my experience of being on Kerrang. I was never once offered heroin by anybody in any band ever. So that says something. And that those guys in those grunge bands, while on the one hand kind of, were quite snooty about rock star lifestyles and mansions and scantily clad women and party attitude, and yet behind the scenes those guys were heavily involved in hardcore drugs that frankly didn't do them very much good.
No. But when you mentioned earlier that you were able to revisit and talk to some of these rock stars and everybody that you did earlier, with all those conversations you had back then and back now, what were the unexpected insights that you gained from the music industry?
I guess from the time that I was really heavily involved in Kerrang, that period from, like I say, 81 to about 90. I don't know about unexpected, if that's quite the right term. But I think looking back on it, what really struck me is that I was kind of quite naive in a way, as were many of the people who wrote for Kerrang. But Kerrang its naivety was its strength. There was a real passion for the music from the people who were writing about it. There was a real sense of camaraderie on the magazine. There was a sense of wanting to share a love of that music with a readership, to want to discover new bands, to give new bands opportunities. All that was very much part of the ethos of the magazine. I think probably where, as an older person, you'd look back on it and think, okay, what the negative side of that was that probably there were certain elements of not understanding how the music business worked particularly. And I think also that from a more selfish point of view, I suppose, we didn't realise the power that we had, which might have been a good thing, because as we were saying, even MTV was obviously hugely important in the evolution of how rock music was sold in America in the 80s, but that didn't really permeate to the UK. And also alongside MTV, Kerrang throughout the 80s still had a cachet as being the Bible of rock. And so what Kerrang said mattered, and what journalists said mattered, because it was often the only way that people would find out about bands, and they would know the journalists and know the journalists' tastes and admire the journalists and have favourites and have people they didn't like. And therefore, they would trust what you said. And that gave Kerrang a power that probably not many of the writers really understood. And as I say, that was probably a good thing, because had we known that, we would have probably approached things rather differently. Especially because that was a period when rock music was generating so much money. I was doing a little bit of research the other day, and I'd say the first LA Guns album was a gold record, 500,000 copies sold, but it only got to number 50 on the Billboard chart.
That's how crazy it was back then.
I mean, 50. It's incredible. So you see how much money was being generated. Number 50 could get a gold album.
That's insane.
That's amazing.
That's insane.
I look back on that and think, wow, there was an awful lot of money being made, and a lot of money was being made off reputations being created by Kerrang, and we were all too stupid and naive to go, hold on a minute, if we're helping people make all this money, maybe we should be making some too. But we didn't look at it that way. And I guess in some ways that's a good thing, because it kept the magazine pure. In some ways that's a bad thing, because as you get older you think, I should have really been better recompensed for what I did. But these are things that you learn as you go through life.
I mean, just like you were saying, just how insane it was back then, because it was making so much money, and you didn't want to abuse it either, because you're like, wait, we like this band a little bit more, then you could have been playing favorites and all that kind of stuff too.
Oh, I think that, it's amazing to me. I look back on it, certainly where I was concerned, there was no payola. The payola that happened, for want of a better term, there was never a bunch of £50 notes in an envelope. The payola happened by the fact that you would get invited to go on a trip to the States or Japan or wherever to go and see a band, and you'd be on the road for 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, and of course everything will be taken care of. And that was a kind of a more subtle way of trying to influence you in your, what you're going to write about the bands, because you would spend time with them and you would probably become friendly with one or two of them. And I suppose in some ways that did have an influence on how you wrote about those groups. But I think that was a relatively low level of bribery, for want of a better term.
Yeah, going off that, what was your craziest trip, or what was the most exciting, fun one you had?
Probably two that really spring to mind, and neither of them were really based on the fact that I was, hugely motivated by the musical side of it. Although, clearly I liked the bands that I was going to look at. In 1984, I spent about 10 days with Iron Maiden when they went behind the Iron Curtain for the first time, which I think, there's a video that came out that people still watch, which was amazing, going to Poland and Czech Republic at a time when, it was still communist rule, and this was the first relaxing of kind of cultural chains. And to be involved in that felt at the time like something important, something that transcended just music journalism. You were seeing the opening of a whole world to people, and the enthusiasm that those people had for the bands because they'd been starved of it for so long was really amazing. And I did a very long kind of 2-issue, major cover story about it, which was quite an important cover for Kerrang. So that's always important to me. And of course, because I went on that, I became friendly with the guys in Maiden, and that's one of the reasons I ended up working with them a little later in my career. So that was one. And then the same year, I went to Japan for the first time. So I would have been 19. And it was organised by a small independent record label in England called Music for Nations, who you probably know, who obviously were the people who put out the first European Metallica albums and Exodus, and all of that thrash stuff was really funneled into Europe via this label, Music for Nations. And so they were a kind of a big deal for an indie, but they were still an indie. They didn't have a lot of money. And they also picked up on the fact there were some Japanese bands who were making a few waves. There was one, that Loudness, that you'll know of, I'm sure.
Yeah, I love Loudness.
A band called Earthshaker. And so they wanted to do something big with Kerrang on the kind of the new wave of Japanese metal. And so I was lucky enough to get flown there. But because they had a very small budget, I flew on my own and was taken care of by the Japanese labels when I got there. So there wasn't even a photographer. But it was an amazing experience because I was there completely on my own, surrounded by Japanese people, living Japanese culture, seeing Japanese bands in Japanese venues, very well looked after, loved Japan. And, that was a real privilege to be able to do something like that. So, those are probably the two things that really stay in my mind from a point of view of being bigger than music. And I guess if it was purely talking about music, it would be working with the Cult, who were, a big favourites of mine. And Billy Duffy's from the same city in England as me, Manchester. He grew up down the road from where I grew up. And so there was a certain affinity. We support the same football team. So both of us kind of had a bond to a certain degree. And that made it doubly enjoyable for me to go and do stories on the road with them, because I not only really was a big fan of their music, but I was engaged on a personal level with Billy.
Nice. So even just going off of that, you had that connection, because my next question would be, what are the challenging aspects of talking to some of these artists? Back then, I get it was the age kind of difference, that power dynamic, but how do you get into their personalities, dig deeper into them? And like you said, it's sharing common things with them first, probably getting to know them a little bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very different world then, because the only way that bands could really kind of reach their target audience certainly in the UK, was through Kerrang, and American record labels knew that Kerrang had a certain cachet in the States. It was a much bigger tastemaker than its sales figures would suggest, because there were probably magazines like Cream would have probably outsold it. Kerrang was only available on import in the States, and a magazine like Cream would have been much bigger. But Kerrang had a real cachet as being the place to go to find out about music, and so that kind of meant that there was a certain attention paid to the magazine, which meant that you got to spend time with people and you got to try and get under their skin a little bit and get to know who they were, which there was clearly a power dynamic and an age difference, which was a negative. But on the positive side, you were with them 24 hours a day for a week, and that it gave you a much greater insight into who those people were and what their motivations were. If you had your antennae up and you were kind of listening and watching properly, you got to see a little bit behind the veil, and that is something that just does not exist anymore. People do not get invited to go on the road, one, because journalism is nowhere near as powerful, because all the mediums are so different and people can access content exactly how they want, when they want, where they want,
like this even.
Exactly. And the second part of that is that rock stars do not want people to have that level of access to them. They do not want them to know about their private lives, partly because we're in a much more litigious culture where people are worried about what they do being seen by people, and then with all the kind of the legal stuff that might unleash. And so there's also the element of the music industry, certainly in terms of rock music, doesn't have the same financial power it once had. So all those things combined mean that as a journalist, all you get to do is sit and talk to someone on a Zoom call for an hour, and that's very difficult to create a rapport with somebody in that short period of time. And what I do on Rock Candy is kind of a different thing, because like we were talking earlier on in the conversation, I knew a lot of the people I'm interviewing first time around, so that gives us a different relationship dynamic. And then also the fact that we're all much older, and to some extent the bands who I'm interviewing, their races run to a certain degree, so they're not having to be in full PR mode all the time. So they can talk in a way about what they've done in their career in a way that's more insightful than it was at the time. So there's negatives and positives to where we are now, and I think that in some ways I'm very glad I did what I did when I did it, because I was young and really enthusiastic about the music, and the reward was the music in itself, and the gigs and the travel and the meeting people and all that good stuff. And now I'm a much older guy, and the reward is in really kind of trying to talk on a different level with those musicians and really find out how they felt as people about what happened to them, and the realities, because Kerrang was very cheerleady, and those guys were very keen to present everything as super polished and wonderful, and it was all just sex, drugs and rock and roll. And now you get to hopefully talk on a more mature level and find out what it was really like, I guess. I mean, maybe lots of people don't want that. Maybe people just want to relive the fantasy of being back in '83 watching Motley Crue, and when they all had hair and they were a few 40 pounds lighter or whatever. And fine, that if that's what people want to do, that's great too. But for me to be satisfied as a journalist, I like to feel that I want to get under the skin of those people more.
It's different for me now. Like you were saying, it's different trying to talk to an artist through a Zoom call or something. I'm very fortunate to be where I'm at just starting out. I've had access to some amazing musicians that I've talked to and some great bands. But again, it's hard to build that rapport just over, it's so impersonal, as opposed to, I've met bands at shows and then I've scheduled interviews like that trying to talk to them, which is cool because we bullshit, I buy them a beer, we hang out for a bit. But like you said, you don't have that level of access back then.
No,
and this medium, yeah.
I don't really see that that's going to change anytime soon. Because bands have so much opportunity to speak directly to their fan base too. So
with the advent of social,
out the middlemen.
With the advent of social media, they could just go live and just start talking to people. Why even need someone like me or, you know, a music journalist now? I guess it's just for the how do you say, nostalgia aspect of it, to watch a formal interview.
Obviously, my whole shtick at my age is, you know, the nostalgia element of it. I make no bones about it. I'm talking about things that happened 30 to 40 years ago, which is kind of a bit weird, but that's where my field of expertise is, and that's where I can bring what I would think is added value to people who are still interested in that stuff by that relationship that I have that goes back, you know, a few decades, and not everybody can do that. So that's where I add the value, but I think it's a niche audience these days, you know, and I think, to be really brutally honest, outside of that nostalgia market, rock is becoming more and more of a niche audience. When I was writing for Kerrang, I think I read a statistic once that rock accounted for, you know, like in like 1985 or whatever year it was, it accounted for 65-70% of all music sales. Now I read somewhere it's like 12, something like that. So, you know, things move on. It's a different world we live in. People who like rock music are still very passionate about it, but it's much more of a niche sport than it ever was before.
I say rock, metal, all of those subgenres, what have you, it's more like a generational thing too, because like I said, my parents got me into this music. I've taken my dad and my mom to shows, you know, they've taken me to shows. Now I see families at these shows. I think we have one of the most dedicated fan bases, but it has shrunk, and it's harder to gain a newer audience because some of this music is, how do you say, not easy listening.
Yeah, I mean, you know, but also the real issue for me is, where is the next generation of mega rock bands? Because, you know, I'm not an expert on this, so I may be wrong, but it seems to me that the bands that still motivate people of all ages are
legacy bands,
the classic rock bands. It's Iron Maiden, it's Kiss, it's Metallica, it's AC/DC, Judas Priest. When, you know, I don't know, I may be wrong about this, but I don't see there's a whole new generation of metal bands coming through that are selling out, you know, 10, 15, 20,000 seater venues. Maybe I'm just not really in the right ballpark to know about this stuff, but it does seem to me, when I see, you know, for example, the Download Festival in the UK, which is obviously the biggest metal festival that's in the UK, the bands that are headlining at that festival are just, you know, the same classic rock bands alternating on a 3-year cycle, and there doesn't seem to be much that's coming through that's going, well, we're the new thing. So I don't know, it's it feels like hard rock is kind of in the main a nostalgia market.
I mean, I could say, from my point of view, some of the newer bands, it's a band from the UK, Sleep Token, if you ever heard of them. They're actually,
yeah, I do.
Yeah, they're actually, yeah. Same with Ghost. Ghost has gotten pretty big. I think for the American side, Lamb of God, I feel like...
But then again, if you're talking about those bands, I saw Ghost opening for Iron Maiden.
Yeah, I say
here in 2017, so we're talking 7 years ago.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. I guess
long time.
I guess I will go circle back to Sleep Token. That is probably one of the newest bands that went from small clubs to an arena the quickest in like 6 or 7 months, and now headlining festivals. I think that's only like one example. All these other bands
do people who go to see Iron Maiden, Kiss, Metallica go to see Sleep Token? I don't know.
That's true. Maybe they do. I mean, I'm going to see them at a festival, but again, like, I lean more towards legacy acts. I love supporting. I even interview like local bands in my area because I'm genuinely passionate about this music, and I feel it's so much harder for bands to get recognized nowadays if you don't have the whole social media thing. I just recently talked to the singer of the thrash metal band Forbidden, Norman Skinner, and he was even telling me with his other band Nivian, they had a great album, labels wanted to pick it up, but they had no social media presence, so they couldn't pick it up. And they had to stop for 4 months sitting on this album to build a social media presence. There's
that's absolutely true. I've heard stories saying unless you have 50,000 followers on social media, then nobody's going to touch you.
And it's hard too for artists nowadays because some of them I've talked to, they can't do this cross-country touring anymore because it's so expensive. It's more or less, it makes sense to do a short stint here, work on your social media because that's how you build fans globally. Then you see what the demand is in that market. Oh, we don't have that many fans over here. We're not going to go over there. As opposed to back in the day with the tape trading, with all that, I feel like it was such more a genuine person-to-person experience that we've kind of gotten away from that, and a lot of bands are getting left behind that I feel are the next big bands.
I think it's just very different world because it's so easy now to use data to analyze everything. And when I was involved in Kerrang at that time, data didn't really come into it. What drove signings was to a large degree the personal passions of the A&R guys, and yes, they would have their eyes and ears to the ground, and obviously if a band was starting to pick up and buzz because they were getting 500 people to a show, that would influence people's decisions and who they went to see. But really it was still more of a freewheeling industry, and that people who signed those groups would be trusted by the labels as having good ears, and then that's how they would get signed. And then of course there's a whole other story that unfolds out of that, which is to do with how long bands are given before they're kind of before a record label decides they're not going to be the big band we thought they were. At one time it was completely natural for a band to get 3, 4, 5 albums before they really start to kind of make any big numbers. Nowadays there are stories going around of people who get 1 EP, and if the EP doesn't happen, they're gone.
I mean,
so and it's a business. It's not the music fun, is it? It's the music industry.
Yeah.
So it's always been like that, and people have always wanted to make money out of things. But I just think that the time cycles that were involved in bands
they've sped up, and
being given the opportunity to prove themselves has sped up massively, and that's a big inhibitor to people to make new music.
That's what sucks. It's like most of my buddies who are in bands where I've seen them grind it out, where they've been playing the local circuit for 5-6 years, and now one of my buddies' death metal bands, Mortal Wound, they just got picked up and went on tour with old thrash bands Violence and Exhorder, which is great. That was cool. They did that whole short tour, but they literally had to do a stop each city along the way to hit that tour. Small shows, they were headlining, but they had local bands opening for them and stuff. But it's just
and making money is so difficult now. They're so difficult.
I've been told by so many people they're just traveling t-shirt salesmen now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's it. Because obviously, for my sins, I also play in a band, and I've
of course we're gonna get to that.
Seen a lot of those anecdotal stories in evidence.
Yeah, so actually I want to touch on your music side of this with Dawn After Dark, and how you guys just recently, in the past few years, started working on things again, and now you have New Dawn Rising that came out about 2 or 3 years ago, which is a killer. Which is killer. I love it.
Well, that's kind of you to say. Dawn After Dark's a whole kind of another string to the bow. I think back in the day, people were suspicious of journalists who wanted to play in bands. And I think now that's dissipated a little bit. I think it's just, I do it because I love music. I did it in the 80s. The band was a kind of, a band based out of Birmingham, England, where Priest and Sabbath came from, and we emerged from there, and we were on the scene in the UK between kind of 86 and 90 for about 4 years, when what you might call that alternative rock scene was really strong in the UK, and it kind of merged into what was known in the UK as grebo music. It was kind of biker rock stuff. So the Cult went from being quite a psychedelic-y band to more of an out-and-out AC/DC rock band. Bands like The Mission and Killing Joke were part of that scene too, and I found that quite invigorating and an interesting alternative to what was going on, in what you might call the Sunset Strip thing. It felt quite authentic because it was more British at its core for me. And so I started playing in a band there, and we had a deal with a small independent label and put some 12-inch singles out and did a lot of touring. And then the band disintegrated in 1990 for usual kind of stupid reasons. And then out of the blue in 2019, a promoter called and was putting on a show in Birmingham with some of the bands that were part of that scene at the time, and asked if we'd be interested in playing on the show, and it seemed like a fun thing to do, so we did. And then it was a really fun night where, much to our surprise, we went on stage, and there were hundreds of people with Dawn After Dark t-shirts who all kind of pulled them out of the
you guys became like that cult band back in the day that was like gone too
people
soon.
Remembered us from back in the day. And okay, this allows me to relive my youth a little bit. And then because that show went well, the promoter also owned a record label, which was the record label coincidentally that we were signed to in the 80s, which was called Chapter 22, and they offered us a deal to make a record, and we'd never made an album, so we felt that it was unfinished business because there were lots of songs that were written, and so we decided we'd do it. And of course, one of the advantages these days is there's no money in making music, but what you can do because of the technology is you can make great sounding music for very little money.
Yeah, which is insane. People are making it at home.
Yeah, so we made an album in 5 days. Did it the old-fashioned way, but in a studio, all of us together. But with digital recording technology these days, you can just create an album that sounds like if it had been recorded in the 80s, it would have cost you $200,000.
Yeah. And I could see your influence on New Dawn Rising, that you were a huge Cult fan. So
yeah, well, the band was obviously influenced by the Cult, and as I say, The Mission and Balaam the Angel, and also AC/DC and classic rock bands, because that was our Birmingham heritage. So that was always going to be in the DNA. And I suppose everybody likes to say, well, we think we sound a little different to everyone else, but yes, of course, those influences are in there.
Oh, yeah. But you still make it your own sound, as well as I was trying to watch some of the old YouTube videos. You had like a old promo video from like back in the 80s. And you guys, you kept true to your sound, but I could see it evolved. Like, how did you want to just go about writing this album?
I think the difference that we had really coming back into it, we were all a lot more experienced as players as well, because all the guys in the band who were still involved, not everybody's involved still from the original lineup, but there are 3 guys there who've been in it for a long time, and they never stopped playing, so they were always going to be improving their chops as the years go by, and you just get better and more confident as a songwriter, as a singer, as a musician. So I think coming back together, we were able to synthesize all the influences that we had into something that sounded more cohesive, and as I say, particularly with being able to write the album New Dawn Rising and record it in such a way that made use of the new technologies to get great sounds but still make it sound authentic, was kind of really important to the way the album turned out. And it's very satisfying when you're doing music that you get to hear what's in your head. And in the 80s, it was very difficult to do that, because if you were working on small budgets, you were hamstrung, and studio technology wasn't as great as it was, and you were working on a time scale that really wasn't conducive to getting the greatest sounding records. So to hear the difference between the records we made in the 80s and the record we put out in 2021, the album that we did then, is, you know, it's very satisfying to hear what you heard in your head. And, you know, obviously my life is spent listening to music, and I guess I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think the music stands up to, you know, anything that's out there, and the production value stands up to anything that's out there.
Absolutely, it's a phenomenal album. I fucking love it, and I'm surprised I haven't heard about you guys, you know, before this. So this is why I love doing this, finding new artists, talking to people like you. This is what I want to do, is just show people what I can, and help if I can, because that album is fucking awesome.
Well, that's very kind of you to say.
So, with all that being said, are you guys going to try to stick together, do some maybe small shows here and there, maybe a little tour, maybe another EP or something?
Yep, there are plans afoot.
Nice.
Right now, with our next project is in the works, and we're going to be talking about that very soon on kind of social media networks for Dawn After Dark. But there is activity afoot for this year, so there's going to be some recorded material, there's going to be some shows. We're doing a festival in the UK, which is one off my bucket list, because I've always wanted to play a festival. It's a festival called the Rising Festival in the UK, which is in July.
Oh yeah.
And also, which is a personal thing for me, we're going to be playing a show in France, which is the first time the band will have played outside the UK, which is exciting for me because I've lived in France for the last 20 years. So that's a personal one off my bucket list. So there are things afoot, and we're doing some shows also with another band from that scene that probably you won't be aware of, but was known in the UK at the time, called Ghost Dance. So we're doing shows with Ghost Dance towards the end of the year.
Ghost Dance?
Like a double header. Yeah.
Let me write that down. I always love listening to new music too and finding bands. Ghost Dance.
Ghost Dance. They were around at that time as well. So that's going to be happening towards the end of the year. So there's activity, and it's fun, and really the reason for doing it is to exercise that muscle of creativity and wanting to make music. Like we discussed earlier, the landscape is entirely different, but fortunately, you know, I'm in a position where I make music for the love of making music and the pleasure of creating and being on stage, and the guys in the band do that. And obviously we're not kids, we're older guys, but
the passion is still there.
The passion's there, and it's more fun this time around because you're not, there's nothing riding on it. You do it for the pure pleasure.
I mean, what did you guys have, like a 30-year hiatus about?
Yeah, I think in 1990 was the last time we did anything, and then we came together in 2019. So that's not bad. That makes Guns N' Roses hiatuses and Boston hiatuses seem like nothing.
But I mean, going off of that right now, if you haven't noticed, there's a trend of a lot of these older bands, coming back together, like that were dormant. Like I would say in the thrash scene, at least, Violence, Ex-Hoarder, Sacred Reich. Those bands were inactive for a very long time. So this trend of just people realizing, hey, I want to get back into music for the fun of it and the love of it, and there's still that demand.
I think that's the most interesting part of the fact that a lot of these bands are regrouping, is that people are finding that while they've gone on and created lives for themselves and presumably had careers and families and done other things, that love of the music is still there. And I think, probably if you spoke to a lot of those guys, just the same as me, I'm almost surprised, because I thought when I was, heavily involved in music in the 80s, both writing for Kerrang and in Dawn After Dark at that time, I never in my wildest dreams thought I'd be doing anything like that 30 years later. And I distinctly remember at the time thinking, I need to be out of music journalism by the time I'm 30, because I don't want to be the old guy at the back of the hall, where all the young kids are. And so I think the biggest surprise about all this is that the the love of making music doesn't subside, and you come back to it, and you come back to it with a lot of passion. And as I say, in many ways, singing in Dawn After Dark is more pleasurable now than it was then, because it's very pure. It's for the fun and for the pleasure I get out of being creative, rather than any kind of sense of wanting to get somewhere with it. You know, obviously we would like to play to as many people as possible, get heard.
Everybody does, yeah.
So, you know, we've got videos for, you know, our songs, Maximum Overdrive and Nothing Can Fulfill Me. There's videos on YouTube that people can look at, and the albums on the streaming platforms everywhere, so people can listen to New Dawn Rising anytime they want. But, you know, I'm also realistic about where we are in the scheme of things, and in many ways that's cool, because every new fan that we get is kind of pure pleasure for us, because, you know, we're not going, shit, if we don't have 50,000 followers of our social media channels, we can't put music out. We have a record label that is very understanding of us and very supportive of us, so we can make music and we can put records out, and, you know, that they're a great label to work with, because they know the parameters under which we operate. And you know, so I've got the album I always wanted to make. I've got a lovely 12-inch vinyl version in flaming orange that is always kind of, you know, one of my things that I always wanted to have in my collection was my record, and that's happened. And there are things that you tick off on the bucket list. You know, like I say, we're going to make new music this year. There's going to be some new recorded material coming out in July, and then a fully fledged second album will happen sometime in 2025. And just the ability to do that and play to people and have people, you know, small and perfectly formed, coming to your shows and loving what you do is a great reward.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I was going to say, so everybody watching, all your links will be down below, so please check out Dawn After Dark, as well as, do you guys have any more LPs? I was trying to find one because I really want one.
Well, I think that the place to find it is through Chapter 22 Records.
Okay.
So Chapter 22 Records and Tapes, I think it's called. But yeah, Chapter 22 Records is the place where people can go to purchase vinyl and
definitely
CDs.
I'll have that link
and
down
of course,
below
Dawn
too.
After Dark, we've got our Bandcamp site where people can also go and buy products and merchandise, the usual stuff. You know, we run a little cottage industry, and you know, that helps support the band and keeps us solvent and keeps us doing it.
Here's something I want to ask you. Do you think I forgot to put it out, but I have a Tigers of Pantang album, and it's an original album, and it even has the official, you know, fan club insert in there, where you fill out and then you order what shirt you want. I was gonna say, do you see Bandcamp as that's what it is nowadays, right? Any band can put up there.
Bandcamp absolutely is. Yeah, it's the place where, you know, small bands and with small fan bases can go and offer exactly that kind of stuff. And it's kind of, like you say, the modern day version of those inserts you used to get in albums at the time.
Yeah,
and
I think they're great.
It's a great resource for bands who are, you know, looking to get their name out there, and for people who are interested in kind of picking up on things that maybe not everybody else sees. Is also, you know, it's a great place to discover stuff.
So even before, when you were getting talked to about, hey, we're going to put on this festival, we'd like you guys to come reunite and everything, were you working for Rock Candy at that time? Because I'm sure hitting all this nostalgia probably had some influence too. You're like, man, I really wish I could play again.
Yeah, probably. I think that's pretty perceptive. I think that doing Rock Candy was definitely something that made me think, yeah, I'd enjoy doing that again. And so that would have been a driver for sure.
That's what I'm saying, because if you're trying to relive all these memories, like, fuck, I was in a band, like, let me get this going again. But did you ever carry any concepts in your head? Because most musicians, you're always either singing or you're writing. Did you have anything? What was the concept going into New Dawn Rising?
Well, the real concept behind that record was that we had probably 35 to 40 songs that were written in that period of time. And only, you know, a dozen of those had ever appeared anywhere. And we felt a lot of that material was some of the strongest stuff we'd done, and it never got a chance to be released. But so that was really kind of part of the concept. But while we're thinking about it, I don't know if you work this out, but there's an interesting side story about Maximum Overdrive, which is the song that opens the New Dawn Rising album, because there was an original version of it recorded in '89 that was released as a 12-inch on Chapter 22. So it's a collector's item from the point of view of our band, but also it's very much a collector's item because it was produced by none other than Stevie Young from AC/DC.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
So Stevie at the time was living in Birmingham, and it was just around '88 when he went out to replace Malcolm Young on AC/DC's, I think it was a Blow Up Your Video tour, because Malcolm was in rehab for drink problems that he had, I believe. And Stevie flew out to fill in for them on that tour, of course, because he was part of that Young clan. He was a nephew, I think. And we in Dawn After Dark rehearsed in a rehearsal space in Birmingham where Stevie was one of the guys who ran the rehearsal space. And so we got to know him, and he had a little 8-track recording studio upstairs, so we knew he was involved in production. And when we got the opportunity to do our third 12-inch for Chapter 22, we asked Stevie if he'd produce, and luckily he said yes. So there's a little bit for any AC/DC kind of collectors out there and enthusiasts. There's a record for you to hunt down, and particularly because Stevie wouldn't allow us to put his name on the.
Really?
Because of his AC/DC connection, so he is credited as Casper Wyoming was his pseudonym. So anybody who's an AC/DC fanatic, you need to go and track down Dawn After Dark's Maximum Overdrive on 12-inch from 1989 on the Chapter 22 label on eBay, and you'll get yourself a piece of rock history.
Hell yeah. Going off of AC/DC, didn't you write a book also, Jumbo Jet, Get Out of My Airport, about AC/DC?
I did. I was a big AC/DC fan. Pretty much up until Back in Black. You know, my era was the Bon Scott era. I was lucky enough to see AC/DC in 1979 with Bon. And they were really, you know, a huge passion of mine when I was growing up. And that book was a kind of like sort of a combination of real kind of trivia for AC/DC fans mixed with a bit of a memoir of my journey through kind of music, you know, with AC/DC as the backdrop. So that was a long time ago that I wrote it, but it was a real, you know, it was a labor of love, and I was very glad that I did it.
Yeah, that's fucking awesome. I want to get a copy of it actually, but I just was like, oh shit, I got to bring that up too.
See, there's a lot on the CV, as you say.
Exactly. Your career has spanned so much in music, from again being an artist, from being a journalist, from being management side. Now going back to the management side, I do want to touch on this. Were there any crazy stories of Iron Maiden that they were getting up to some hijinks that you're like, damn it, why are they doing this? Like, don't drink the bar dry.
There were certainly hijinks on that Polish thing where Bruce and I ended up in a slightly tricky situation, which he wrote about in his autobiography about 3 or 4 years ago, where the two of us had ended up in a liaison with some local girls and ended up back on an estate somewhere in the middle of nowhere that neither of us knew how to get back from. And certainly in my case, the young lady's father turned up unexpected, and that was slightly awkward. So Bruce wrote about it in his book, so that's why I kind of feel that I'm allowed to divulge a few trade secrets then.
There you go. Actually, bringing up Bruce, I just saw him. He played the Whiskey A Go-Go in Hollywood.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
I was there. Hey, he still has it, and he was running. There was not a lot of stage for him to run around, but he was still going.
he seems very motivated by his solo project. Yeah,
I thought it was pretty good. But To wrap all of this off, is there anything you want to touch on? We talked about the future projects you have going on. What about Rock Candy? How is that going? Any other good issues coming up? Like any really cool covers coming up, or what do you got going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Rock Candy has been, a real passion for the last 7 years. It kind of is very much a magazine of its time in some ways, in that it has to be run in a very different way to how magazines were run back in the day. It's obviously much more niche, so therefore you have to be very agile in your thinking, and it's produced now, even though we're very old school in that there's a physical magazine that's available in the States. You can get it through Barnes and Noble. Obviously it's published out of the UK, but there's a physical copy that's available, which I think a lot of people really enjoy. They like the feel of having a magazine in their hands again. It takes them back to a very different era. And yet the way the magazine is produced is very modern, in so much as I'm based in France as the editor. The designer is in the UK. The person who deals with social media is in the Netherlands. So it's in many ways it's a true hybrid of old school values and new school technology that allows us to do it. And I'm very passionate about what the mission statement is, for want of a better term, in that it's about helping people relive those glory days, but hopefully bringing a perspective to it that is now much more mature and befitting of people who've grown with the music and have grown with the artists, and we go very deep on our subject matters. It's not about a short soundbite like a YouTube clip or a TikTok clip. It's very much about getting under the skin of the artist, and we run articles to 8-10 pages in length, and there's a lot to read in there, and we believe that is our point of difference. And so if people feel the same passion for the music that we do, we think that they will get a lot out of reading something that really does go deep under the skin. When I was a kid, I was insatiable for reading about the people whose music I admired. I just wanted to gather up as much information as I possibly could. And I know there's a lot of people these days who don't feel the same way about it. They just want to listen to music, and that's good enough for them. But that's not who Rock Candy caters for. We cater for people who've got that same passion and really want to go deep. And I think that it gives us our unique flavour.
Yeah, I was going to say, it gives you that much deeper understanding of why they wrote this song. I love that, looking at the history of a band, like, why did they write this, or how did that go about it? It seems like a lot of music is superficial nowadays, like you were saying, where we just want to listen to it and that's about it. But
yeah, I mean, I was, interestingly enough, I was just talking to, I'll give a little trade secret away for the next issue, is that I was talking to Phil Collen and Rick Savage from Def Leppard about the making of Pyromania, and that runs over 10 pages, and that's some real, really deep insight from the guys who were there, boots on the ground, making that record. And I found it fascinating talking to them to really get the minutiae of what went on. That's just me. I'm insatiable for deep dive knowledge, and so that's really our kind of calling card, is to say that we do things differently to most people, and we go deep, and hopefully people go along for the ride with us and get a lot out of it. And it gives them something to read for 2 months while we make the next one.
I mean, I read the American, I guess, version of that, Decibel, because I like it because it comes with a flexi disc and everything too. But I want to pick up a copy of your magazine too, to get insight on all these classic artists. But everybody should check out Rock Candy. Again, everything will be down below. Howard, I appreciate you joining me. Is there anything else you want to say before we close out?
Shane, I've really enjoyed discussing my long career with you. I'm glad you've taken an interest in both my writing and Dawn After Dark, and obviously it's nice to have somebody from over the pond who's taking the time, so much appreciated.
Oh yeah. Everybody, please check out all of Howard's stuff down below. Till next time, everybody, take care.